parking lot at dusk. Someone sits in their car after work, engine off, keys still in hand, unable to explain why they haven't gone inside yet. It's not exhaustion exactly, though it wears that costume convincingly. It's something closer to a held breath the body forgot to release hours ago. Sitting low in the sternum, waiting for permission. It never asked for out loud. This happens in different cities, different countries, different lives that will never intersect. And it happens on the same evenings, in the same quiet way, to people who would never think to compare notes with a stranger. You've had that moment, maybe not in a car, maybe standing at a sink, water running, hands still, staring at nothing in particular for longer than the task required. Something pulls your attention sideways, away from the dishes, away from the day, toward a feeling you can't quite name and don't have time to chase right now. Here's the pattern almost nobody names correctly, because naming it honestly means admitting you've been treating a signal as static for longer than you'd like to admit. You've called it burnout, called it needing a vacation, called it simply getting older and losing the energy you used to have for ordinary days. But burnout doesn't usually arrive with this particular texture, a kind of stretching sensation, as if your attention were being pulled toward something just outside its normal range. Millions of people are feeling this right now, in this exact season, and almost none of them are talking about it directly with anyone close to them. Not because it's shameful, because there's no shared language yet for a feeling this specific, this widespread, and this quiet. You've noticed time behaving strangely too, haven't you? Certain ordinary Tuesdays stretch on, heavy with something you can't locate. Other stretches of weeks disappear almost entirely, leaving barely an impression behind them. Here's the first real crack in what you've probably assumed about all of this. This feeling isn't random neurological noise, and it isn't simply modern life catching up with an exhausted nervous system. Both of those explanations are convenient. Neither one actually accounts for the timing, the consistency, or the strange specificity of what so many people are describing at once. Certain traditions describe an intelligence connected to Andromeda, associated with expanded perception, with dimensional awareness, with a frequency oriented toward stretching the boundaries of what a mind considers normal. Whatever name feels right to you for that presence, the function described across very different accounts stays oddly, almost suspiciously consistent. Listen. That claim deserves real scrutiny, not blind acceptance, and it deserves exactly that scrutiny before you decide what to actually do with it tonight. But scrutiny isn't the same thing as automatic dismissal, especially when the description matches something you've already sensed alone, in moments you couldn't quite explain to the people standing closest to you. Here's the part almost nobody names correctly when they talk about this kind of shift. It was never really about proof arriving dramatically enough to convince a skeptical mind once and for all. Proof was never really the point of any of this. The mechanism operates in something quieter. Perception, bandwidth, the specific range your attention is willing to register without flinching. And that mechanism doesn't wait for your permission before it starts working on you anyway. You're already responding to it right now in this exact moment, whether you've named it consciously or not, reaching for a familiar explanation instead of sitting with what's actually stretching underneath the surface of tonight. Here's where this needs to slow down for a second, because the instinct to locate the source somewhere impossibly far away in a distant galaxy, in beings entirely separate from your own daily existence, misses where this shift actually begins. It doesn't start with a civilization deciding, on a whim, to widen your perception from somewhere across unimaginable distance. It begins inside your own attention, in the exact moment you decide whether this stretching sensation gets a real name or gets filed away as nothing. What people call an Andromedan shift is, underneath the language, simply perception expanding past a range it spent years agreeing to stay confined within. Without noticing that difference, the whole subject stays distant, abstract. Something happening near a galaxy instead of something happening through the quality of your own attention right now. I put something together for exactly the moment you're standing in tonight, and I want to be honest with you about why it matters right now, specifically to you. What you've been feeling isn't confusion, and it isn't simply tiredness catching up with you at the end of a long week. It's the early edge of a recognition that your own perception has been quietly stretching for longer than you've had language to describe it. I invite you to download the digital book I prepared for you, The Great Spiritual Game Hidden Behind Your Consciousness. Because this video can point toward that recognition, but it can't walk you through the entire structure sitting behind it. Inside those pages, the connection between this expansion and your own daily attention gets laid out clearly. What's actually widening inside you, why it's intensifying now, and what it quietly asks of you as someone already living inside the shift. This isn't speculation dressed up as certainty, and it isn't another list of predictions to wait on nervously. It's a map built for people who sense correctly that something larger is moving and want real structure underneath that feeling. The link is waiting in the first pinned comment below this video, ready whenever you decide to look. Read it slowly, without rushing toward conclusions, and notice which lines feel less like new information and more like something you already suspected quietly, on your own, long before tonight ever gave it real words. You close that thought for now, but the stretching sensation doesn't fully close with it. It stays present at the edges, the way peripheral vision registers movement you can't quite bring into focus. Because once you allow yourself to consider that your perception might genuinely be expanding, a sharper question follows close behind it. If it's already widening, why does some part of you keep quietly working to pull it back to its old dimensions? Here's where the pattern turns personal, faster than most people expect it to. You catch a flash of insight during a mundane task, something that feels larger than the moment deserves, and within seconds you've already shrunk it back down to random thought and moved on. That shrinking feels like practicality. It isn't. It's a rehearsed contraction. So practiced it no longer registers as a choice you're actively making. You tell yourself you're being sensible by not reading too much into a strange sense of expansiveness, a moment of unusually clear perception. Sometimes that's genuinely wise, and sometimes underneath that reasonable-sounding caution, there's simply fear of a range you don't yet know how to hold steady. Listen, grounding yourself and shrinking yourself can look nearly identical from the inside, but only one of them keeps you exactly where you've always been. Real grounding lets expansion in and still keeps both feet on the floor. Shrinking closes the aperture before it can even fully open, then congratulates itself quietly for staying so stable about nothing ever widening at all. Pause here for a second. Notice the space behind your eyes. Is it relaxed or slightly compressed, as if bracing against a width it hasn't decided it can hold yet tonight? Release it deliberately, right now, and notice how much effort that actually required from you. That effort is an old pattern, mid-operation, doing exactly what it always does, quietly, automatically, without asking your permission first. This is the mechanism almost nobody names correctly when they talk about resisting expanded perception. The mind doesn't reject a wider range because it's incapable of holding it. It rejects it because, somewhere earlier in your life, perceiving too much at once felt overwhelming, even dangerous, and no update was ever issued to say that particular danger had passed. Think about the last time you had an unusually vivid insight, one that arrived faster and clearer than thought usually moves. What did you do with it in that moment? Most people minimize it instantly, reflexively, before the sensation even finishes registering fully. That minimizing isn't always denial. Sometimes it's simply the fastest available exit from a width too large to hold comfortably in that particular instant. You've done this yourself somewhere at some point, shrinking a moment of genuine expansion too quickly, not because you examined it honestly and found it lacking, but because shrinking it felt safer than sitting with a range you hadn't yet learned to trust. That isn't a character flaw worth punishing. It's a mechanism, and mechanisms can be studied calmly, without turning the study into self-judgment. If you're still here, past the point where the easy shrinking usually takes full control, that isn't nothing. Something in you already suspects there's more worth examining here than a quick contraction would allow, and that suspicion is exactly the beginning of what this whole conversation keeps circling steadily back toward. Let's go deeper into how this resistance actually operates. Because the surface behavior, the minimizing, the quick return to ordinary focus, the fast dismissal of a wider moment, is only the visible edge of something larger underneath. There's a quieter calculation constantly running beneath it. If I let this range stay open and I can't manage it, I'll feel overwhelmed in front of my own life. If I shrink it immediately, at least I stay inside dimensions I already know how to navigate. Either way, the mind flags expansion as risk, and risk gets minimized by default, long before genuine curiosity ever gets an honest vote. So you stay suspended in a familiar, narrow bandwidth, open enough to notice these moments when they arrive, cautious enough to never quite let them widen your actual daily experience of life. That narrowness feels safe. It also guarantees you keep experiencing only a fraction of what's actually available to you, no matter how many of these moments keep arriving. Here's where the difference between healthy grounding and disguised contraction becomes worth naming clearly, once you actually look at it directly instead of past it. Grounding stays rooted while still allowing genuine range to move through it. Contraction disguised as grounding treats any widening as instability, using narrowness as false proof of stability. You've likely met both versions somewhere in your own circle of people. The one who stays steady and still lets perception widen naturally when it arrives, versus the one who treats any expanded moment as something to manage down immediately, using narrowness as a permanent floor rather than a temporary resting point. One grows with what arrives. The other simply protects the same fixed range indefinitely, dressed up convincingly as being sensible. Notice what's happening inside you right now, in this exact instant, while you're weighing how seriously to take everything said so far tonight. Some part of you is already deciding quietly whether to let this actually widen something real or to file it away later as interesting but probably nothing, and return to the same narrow range unchanged. That decision, made in the space of a few seconds, is itself the entire mechanism this section has been carefully describing, happening live, inside you, as you listen. Here's an uncomfortable truth worth sitting with instead of deflecting immediately tonight. This resistance isn't happening to you from some outside force keeping your perception deliberately narrow. It's a loop running quietly in your own attention, reinforced every single time a wider moment gets overridden by the comfort of staying exactly within the range you've always known. Think about the last unusually clear moment that actually reached you fully instead of getting shrunk back down within minutes. Did it stay with you for hours afterward, working on something underneath conscious thought? Or did you manage to compress it back to ordinary size almost immediately? That answer tells you more about your actual relationship to this expansion than any belief you'd state out loud to someone else. This is where the ground shifts again, so stay with it a little longer tonight. You don't need more evidence that these moments are happening. You've likely already collected more than enough of them over recent months to fill several conversations you've never actually had the courage to start with anyone close to you. What's missing isn't proof. What's missing is permission, granted from somewhere deeper than caution alone, to actually let this wider range be real. And here's a question worth holding quietly in silence, rather than rushing to answer out loud immediately tonight. If everything described here turned out to be accurate, if your perception really is widening towards something larger than your usual range, would the version of you sitting here right now know what to actually do with that expansion? Or would some old, practiced contraction quietly shrink it back down to something manageable enough to forget by morning? That contraction has a name, and it isn't stability, and it isn't wisdom either. It's the friction between the actual width of what's arriving and the identity you've built carefully around staying narrow enough to remain comfortable inside a familiar, predictable range. If you've made it this far, past every reflex specifically built to shrink you back early tonight, that isn't accidental in the slightest way. Not everyone stays present for the part where the language stops offering easy contraction and starts asking something real of them instead. And if this is still landing clearly for you, you're already standing somewhere different from where most viewers give up and quietly retreat into old range. That's exactly where this goes next. Not into more moments of expansion to catalog nervously, not into another list of signs to watch obsessively for, into the deeper structure underneath all of it, who you've quietly decided you're allowed to become. Once this widening stops feeling like something happening to you and starts feeling like something already living inside your own perception. Who you're allowed to become in relation to this widening perception isn't decided by how many expanded moments you've quietly gathered over recent months. It's decided by something quieter, something that operates whether those moments arrive often or barely at all. Call it the ceiling you placed, without ever consciously choosing it, over what feels possible for someone exactly like you to actually hold. Here's the simplest way to describe it, stripped of anything overly mystical tonight. Identity is just the story your mind keeps repeating about who you are, so consistently in so many small ordinary moments that it stopped sounding like a story and became something you mistake entirely for settled fact. Facts don't get questioned. They simply get lived inside, quietly, day after unremarkable day. This is exactly where wanting a wider range and believing you're actually capable of holding it split apart from each other, even though most people treat those two things as identical. You can want this expansion with your whole chest and still not believe, underneath that wanting, that it was ever really meant for someone like you specifically. Desire lives in imagination. Identity lives somewhere older, somewhere imagination has to formally request entry before anything real gets granted. Think about the people who seem to hold expanded perception with unusual ease, almost effortlessly, while others glimpse the exact same range for years and immediately compress it back down every time. It was never really about sensitivity or luck or some rare gift handed selectively to a few at birth. It was about which of them had already decided, somewhere below conscious thought, that this range belonged inside their identity rather than remaining outside it, waiting to be earned through more effort. Listen, hoping you might one day hold a wider perception, and expecting that range as simply part of who you already are. Those aren't the same internal posture, even though they sound nearly identical when spoken aloud. Hope reaches toward an outcome that might or might not arrive, negotiating constantly with doubt the whole way there. Expectation already lives inside the outcome, calm, almost bored by its own certainty, entirely unmoved by whatever noise tries to shake it loose. Here's a small, ordinary example because this pattern hides best in ordinary moments rather than dramatic ones. Someone mentions, almost casually, that you seem to notice things other people miss entirely, like you're operating on a slightly wider frequency. Watch what happens in the half second before you respond to that observation. Some people simply receive it. Others deflect instantly, insisting they're not special at all, as if that width itself required immediate defense. That reflex isn't humility, it's identity, quietly protecting its current shape against information that doesn't match the file it's already holding about who you're supposed to be. You've done this yourself, somewhere, in some corner of your life, likely without even noticing it happening in real time as it occurred. It isn't a flaw worth punishing yourself over tonight. It's a mechanism, and mechanisms can be studied calmly, the same way you'd study a pattern showing up in someone else's life instead of your own. The mind isn't sabotaging you here. It's staying coherent, because holding two contradictory beliefs about your own capacity creates a specific, uncomfortable friction most people will do almost anything to avoid feeling directly. That friction shows up right after something unusually clear happens to you. A moment of expanded perception arriving faster than doubt has time to catch up with it. Instead of trusting it, there's often a flicker of suspicion, as if that clarity itself were somehow too easy to be legitimate. That flicker is coherence, quietly pulling you back toward the story it already believes is true about your actual capacity to hold this range. Pause here for a moment. Notice your breathing and let it slow just slightly. Ask yourself honestly, when a wider perception arrives easily, do you trust it, or do you brace instinctively for the contraction that surely has to be coming to correct it? That bracing isn't wisdom, even though it's remarkably skilled at wearing wisdom's expression convincingly. Here's the part that tends to reorganize everything once it's actually understood clearly tonight. This expansion isn't only responding to how open you claim to be out loud. It's responding to what feels familiar to you personally. And for most people, width and familiarity have almost nothing in common yet, which is exactly why so few ever notice the gap directly for themselves. If you've stayed with this past the point where distraction usually wins out completely, some part of you already suspected this before tonight gave it clear language to finally hold on to. That isn't coincidence. It's what happens when something true meets a mind that was already circling this exact question quietly, alone, long before finding real words for it here tonight. Let's go further, because identity isn't only belief. It's rehearsed familiarity, built through repetition until it feels less like a choice and more like weather. You simply learned to live inside without ever questioning it directly. You didn't decide once, cleanly, that a narrow range was your natural size. You lived through enough ordinary moments where narrowness felt safe that your system quietly filed it as reliable, something to return to rather than something worth re-examining honestly. This is why simply wanting to hold more rarely holds for very long under genuine testing. Wanting operates in the conscious mind, the newest, most recent layer of the entire system. Identity operates underneath it, older, faster, largely indifferent to whatever your conscious mind has recently decided it wants to believe about itself tonight. Here's where all of this starts to reshape how you understand everything discussed so far in this conversation. It was never only about noticing these moments accurately as they arrive, waiting patiently for them to become undeniable proof. It's about which range your system has quietly filed as familiar enough to actually hold, because familiar is what gets reinforced, regardless of how consciously you want to feel differently in the meantime. This is exactly why some people can read every account of expanded perception, study every description, and still contract back to their old range within minutes, no matter how convinced their intellect becomes. The information was never really the problem here. The mismatch between information and identity was, you can believe the concept thoroughly and still meet these moments from an identity that was never updated to hold what genuine expansion actually requires of you. Real change here doesn't begin with consuming more accounts, more descriptions, more convincing arguments about why this range is real. It begins with smaller, stranger moments. Noticing the flicker of suspicion when clarity arrives too easily. Noticing the reflex to shrink your own width. Noticing the quiet discomfort right before you're about to trust something you've spent years compressing instead of examining. Not everyone catches this the first time it's said plainly tonight. Most people hear your identity decides what range you can hold and nod along politely, then return to waiting for more proof, expecting the universe to hand them permission to feel differently about who they are. If something in you just sat up a little straighter at that sentence, that reaction alone puts you somewhere different from where most viewers are still sitting right now. Here's something worth being honest with you about, because pretending otherwise would waste both of our time tonight. A single video, however clear, can describe the shape of this expansion. It cannot walk you through the actual patient work of rebuilding an identity capable of holding it fully and steadily. That work has sequence. It has real structure. It has specific ways of recognizing familiarity before it hardens back into fact, and I built exactly that inside the great spiritual game hidden behind your consciousness. I invite you to download that digital book now. I prepared it specifically for the moment you're standing in tonight, not as another catalog of strange moments to watch for anxiously, but as a working structure for becoming someone capable of actually holding what you've already been sensing for months now. It goes further than any single video ever could into how identity actually forms around a wider range like this, how it gets mistaken for imagination, and how it quietly negotiates with every expanded moment before you're even consciously aware a reaction was chosen at all. This isn't a collection of proof meant to convince skeptics. It's the missing layer underneath everything you've already felt and never quite had language to trust fully until now. The link is waiting in the first pinned comment, the same place it's been since this conversation started tonight. What you've sensed for months, that quiet suspicion that your own perception has room to widen further, isn't something to keep filing away as imagination any longer. It's already moving. The only real question left is whether you meet it from an identity actually built to hold it. There's a sensation worth naming before anything else here, because this next part isn't only conceptual. You'll feel it first as a subtle widening at the temples, the kind that shows up right before something reorganizes rather than breaks apart entirely. Let it sit there a moment before reaching for explanation. Everything discussed so far has stayed close to behavior and identity. What you do, what you've quietly decided is true about your own capacity to hold a wider range. There's a layer underneath even that, closer to how this expansion actually reaches you in the first place, before identity ever gets a chance to react to it at all. Call it a lens. Not a belief system, not a personality trait. The actual shape through which raw perception gets filtered before it becomes something you can finally name clearly. Certain traditions describe this particular lens as tied to Andromeda, associated with dimensional awareness, with a frequency oriented toward stretching boundaries rather than delivering spectacle for its own sake. Set the mythology aside for a moment and look at the function underneath the name instead. Whatever you call it, its job stays precise. It decides what gets through clearly, what arrives distorted, and what never lands at all because it doesn't match the shape already carved into your particular way of receiving. Here's why naming it matters practically tonight, not poetically. Vague language keeps vague confusion firmly in place. I feel wider sometimes, explains nothing, and changes nothing about how you actually respond to it moving forward. My lens compresses anything that threatens my sense of a manageable range before I'm even aware of receiving it. That's a mechanism. Mechanisms can be worked with directly. Vague feelings can only be endured indefinitely, quietly, alone. Pause here for a moment. Feel the space between your eyebrows. Is it soft or slightly drawn, bracing for a width that hasn't decided it can hold yet tonight? Soften it deliberately right now and notice how much effort that actually required from you just now. That effort is the lens, mid-operation, doing exactly what it always does. Quietly, automatically, without ever asking your permission first. Everything named so far, the reflexive shrinking of expanded moments, the identity too small to hold real width, the deflection of your own perceptiveness as if it needed excusing constantly. None of it was separate information. It was the same lens, showing up in different rooms of your attention, wearing different disguises each time so it wouldn't be recognized as the same visitor returning again and again. This is where the whole approach quietly changes direction tonight. Most people, once they sense this range widening inside them, respond by trying to do more. More meditation, more effort thrown at forcing an expansion that was never meant to be forced open in the first place. That instinct is understandable. It's also, in this specific case, almost always the wrong move entirely. And here's the precise reason it fails. You don't need more effort directed outward right now. You need less contradiction inside your own response to what's already quietly widening. Every moment of genuine openness held while the lens still compresses for safety creates two competing signals, fighting inside the same narrow channel. And the lens, loyal to its oldest instructions, will side with the older signal nearly every single time it's given the chance. Say that part again, slower, because it tends to undo years of anxious effort in a single sentence tonight. It's not about trying harder to expand. It's about no longer working against your own width, in the same breath you're actively trying to build it. Stop contradicting the range you're asking for, and it finally has somewhere real to land instead of colliding with its own opposite the moment it actually arrives. Here's a question worth actually answering, not just letting slide past unexamined tonight. In the last week, how many times did you feel a genuine flicker of expanded perception, only to immediately undercut it with a thought like, "That's probably just my mind wandering, nothing more"? That second thought isn't neutral commentary. It's a direct instruction delivered to the exact same lens that just received the first, quieter signal only seconds before it. This is where intensity gets mistaken for genuine progress, and the two deserve careful separating tonight. Intensity is loud, dramatic meditation attempts, urgent searching for expanded states everywhere you look, emotional peaks that feel significant in the moment and exhaust you completely by evening. Stability is quiet, the same simple, uncontradicted openness held day after unremarkable day, without needing a dramatic breakthrough to justify its own presence. The lens doesn't respond to intensity nearly as strongly as most people assume it does. It responds to consistency, to a signal that shows up the same way whether you're actively searching or simply living an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. A quiet, stable openness held across months will outlast a loud, intense searching held across 3 excited days, without exception whatsoever. If you've noticed yourself settling rather than straining through this particular section, that's not a small thing to overlook tonight. Not everyone stays present for the part where the language gets more precise, less dramatic, more like mechanics than mystery. If this is landing clearly for you, You're already standing somewhere different from where most viewers remain, still waiting for the next dramatic breakthrough to finally convince them completely. Not everyone who watches this will actually let their own range widen because of it. Here's the part that tends to reframe everything discussed so far. Once it's actually understood at this level clearly, this expansion was never simply something external to detect and wait for from a safe, cautious distance. It's closer to a frequency held locally, inside your own attention, that the lens then reflects back to you as the specific width your experience of perception ends up taking shape around. That reframing changes what you actually do next, practically, starting tonight rather than someday in the vague future. You stop scanning outward compulsively, hoping enough moments will finally produce the confidence you're looking for. You start noticing where, right now, in this ordinary evening, you're contradicting the width you claim to want, and you simply stop doing that, one contradiction at a time, without needing a dramatic breakthrough to mark the shift. This isn't for everyone listening tonight, and that deserves saying plainly instead of softened for comfort. Most people will hear this and find it interesting, then return tomorrow to the same narrow range, unchanged, because actually holding a wider lens costs more than simply understanding the concept intellectually ever will. Understanding is the easy part. Living from that width is the part almost nobody follows all the way through to the end. That's where the next layer opens. Not into more explanation of the lens itself, but into what it actually costs you, specifically, every time you let contraction run the show instead of catching it early, before it settles into something harder to name and even harder to undo later on. The cost of letting contraction run the show doesn't announce itself in a single dramatic evening. It gathers the way a muscle held tense for years quietly forgets how to fully release, even when nothing is actually threatening it anymore. A week of shrinking, expanded moments doesn't feel unusual while you're inside it. A decade of the same habit starts to feel like personality, like simply who you turned out to be around this particular subject. This is worth naming plainly, because vague spiritual language tends to soften exactly what should stay sharp here tonight. Contradiction has a price, and the price is range. The specific, unrepeatable kind, spent staying small enough to feel manageable instead of actually inhabiting what you've already sensed correctly for months now. That isn't guilt, it's arithmetic. And arithmetic deserves honesty more than comfort right now. Think about someone you've known who insists, constantly, that they'd love to perceive more, to feel more, to live from a wider frequency if it ever actually happened to them directly and clearly. And yet somehow, every expanded moment in their own life gets compressed within seconds. Every unusual insight gets dismissed as random static instead of signal. From outside, the pattern is obvious within the first few sentences. From inside, it feels like each moment is simply nothing. Nothing more than that. You've probably been that person yourself, in some corner of your own experience with all of this. Maybe not perception specifically, maybe a persistent sense that you're capable of more than your current life reflects back to you, a feeling that arrives and then quietly gets shrunk down anyway. The specific experience matters less than the shape, and the shape stays consistent. A stated openness, running directly against an unspoken compression, with the compression quietly winning nearly every single time it's actually tested honestly. Here's what genuine expansion actually means here. Once you strip away the aesthetic language surrounding it entirely, it isn't a constant, dramatic state of heightened perception happening every waking minute, and it isn't pretending every unusual feeling must carry enormous cosmic significance immediately. Expansion is simpler and far less glamorous than that. It's the absence of active contradiction between the range you claim out loud and the automatic shrinking you keep running quietly in the background of an ordinary evening like this one. You don't need to feel electrified constantly to be genuinely expanded. You need to stop actively arguing against the moments you say you welcome, in the small, unnoticed instances that never make it into the story you tell others about yourself. That's a lower bar than most spiritual content suggests, and it's also a far more honest one you can actually meet repeatedly without needing a dramatic breakthrough to sustain your belief in it. Pause for a moment here and notice your peripheral awareness. Is it soft and wide or slightly narrowed, as if bracing against a range that hasn't even arrived yet tonight? Widen it deliberately, And notice how unfamiliar that widening feels if you've been narrowed for a long stretch without fully realizing it was happening at all. Here's a consequence rarely discussed openly, because it's uncomfortable in a way most content about this subject tends to avoid entirely. Every year spent in contradiction doesn't just delay this expansion, it reinforces the belief that a wider range was never really available to someone like you in the first place. The delay becomes its own evidence, feeding back into the shrinking that caused it, tightening the loop instead of loosening it gradually over time. That's the part worth sitting with honestly, without flinching away too quickly tonight. It isn't only that nothing seemed to widen, it's that the narrowness itself became proof in your own mind that this range was never really meant for you specifically. And that proof gets cited every time expansion shows up, looking slightly too easy to trust fully at first. If you're still here, past the point where comfort usually ends and honesty usually starts costing something real, that isn't coincidence, and it never has been tonight. Something in you decided, before this video even started playing, that it was finally time to stop managing the contraction and start actually examining what sits quietly underneath it. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from managing contradiction instead of resolving it fully and honestly. You've felt it. The tiredness that has nothing to do with how much sleep you got. The kind that shows up after a day where nothing physically demanding even happened around you at all. That's not overthinking. That's the cost of holding two opposing signals steady at once, hour after hour, without ever letting either one fully speak clearly. Most people misdiagnose that exhaustion as simply being an overthinking person by nature, as if temperament alone explained the whole pattern completely. That diagnosis is comforting, and it's also almost always incomplete tonight. The exhaustion isn't from thinking too much. It's from claiming openness while simultaneously rehearsing contraction in 100 small, unexamined moments across a single ordinary day. Here's where the body enters this conversation directly, because none of this stays purely mental for very long once it settles in fully. Contradiction held long enough doesn't just tire the mind. It settles into the temples, the crown of the head, the space behind the eyes, the places where width has nowhere left to go once the mind stops metabolizing the tension consciously on its own. This is not for everyone listening tonight, and that needs saying plainly instead of softened for comfort right now. Most people will hear this and quietly find it interesting, then return tomorrow to the exact same narrowing, unchanged. Because actually resolving it costs something intellectual understanding alone never demands of anyone. Understanding is the inexpensive part. Living differently is the part almost nobody follows all the way through completely, even once. If something in you just resisted that sentence slightly, good. That resistance means it landed somewhere real, not somewhere abstract and easy to nod past from a safe emotional distance tonight while listening quietly. Here's the new layer worth adding to everything already said so far tonight. Alignment with this particular expansion isn't a single decision made once and maintained automatically afterward without any further effort. It's closer to a practice, repeated in small, unremarkable moments, mostly invisible to anyone watching your life from the outside completely. Nobody applauds you for noticing a contracting thought and quietly choosing not to feed it further tonight, alone, in an ordinary room. Consider what changes, specifically, once contradiction stops being your default response to a widening moment arriving. Recognition stops requiring so much internal debate, because there's no longer a second, narrowing voice arguing constantly against the wider one in real time. Expanded moments stop feeling like they require immediate explanation, because the explaining itself was often just compensation for a width that wasn't stable enough to hold steadily on its own 2 feet. This is where urgency finally deserves to enter the conversation honestly, without any manipulation attached to it whatsoever. Not urgency borrowed from a countdown or some limited window closing somewhere far away from you tonight. Real urgency, the kind that comes from doing simple math about how many more years you're willing to spend financing the same contraction, before finally addressing what's actually sitting underneath it. That math is yours to do, quietly, tonight, away from this video entirely, and on your own terms, in your own time. Nobody else can do it for you. And no single video, however clear, can walk you through resolving years of rehearsed narrowing in the space of 20 minutes total. What it can do, what this conversation has been doing since the very first moment tonight, is make the pattern visible enough that pretending not to see it finally stops feeling honest to you at all. There's a specific kind of relief that arrives once contradiction gets named clearly, instead of vaguely sensed underneath everything else happening in your life. It's not celebration. It's quieter than that. Closer to finally setting down something heavy you'd forgotten you were even still carrying through every narrowed moment this year alone. That relief is where the next part actually begins, not with more explanation of what's wrong, but with what it actually looks like to meet this specific expansion differently, starting from wherever you happen to be standing right now, tonight, without waiting for more proof to arrive first before you begin. Meeting this expansion differently doesn't start with a dramatic breakthrough finally arriving to convince you completely once and for all. It starts smaller than that, quieter than that, almost too ordinary to register as the beginning of anything significant at all tonight. You simply catch one contracting thought once in real time and choose not to feed it further. That's the entire mechanism. No proof required first, ever. Let's gather what's actually been said tonight. Not as a summary to skim past quickly, but as a shape worth seeing whole for the first time clearly. There was never only ordinary static happening in that parking lot, in that quiet kitchen, waiting for enough evidence to finally break through convincingly. There was a lens, deciding long ago what range counted as safe enough to hold. There was contraction dressed carefully as sensible caution. There was an identity too small to hold what's actually already widening. And underneath all of it, one single mechanism, repeating itself in different disguises so it would never be recognized as the same pattern twice in a row. Here's something worth feeling honestly before this closes tonight, for good. None of this was ever really about waiting for something to arrive from somewhere impossibly far away, moment by moment, sign by sign. It was about attention, where it rests, what it's decided to call too much, what it quietly stopped questioning long before tonight ever gave it real language to hold. Change attention's relationship to its own range, and the entire experience of expansion reorganizes itself completely, without needing anything external to prove itself first. You were never too small for this. You were only unpracticed at holding what was always yours. You came into this video carrying a familiar stretching sensation, and by now, that sensation finally has a shape it didn't have an hour ago. It has a mechanism. It has a location, not somewhere among distant stars, not only in strange moments waiting to be cataloged and studied later on. It lives in the quiet architecture of what you've decided is possible for you to hold. And it has been running there, mostly unexamined, for longer than you've had words to name it clearly until right now. Here's the part that tends to stay after everything else fades, so let it settle rather than rushing past it quickly tonight. This was never about distance at all, not once. It was about capacity, something older than any single moment, still active, still asking something specific of everyone sensing it at once across the entire world tonight. And what gets contracted can, eventually, be met clearly, not through more proof, but through noticing, repeated calmly, without needing certainty to arrive first, before you begin the work. The link is waiting in the first pinned comment beneath this video, exactly where it's been since this conversation started tonight. I want to be honest with you about something before you close this tab and let the night carry you somewhere else entirely on your own. Material like this rarely stays available for long, not because of manufactured scarcity, but because what's written in those pages tends to unsettle narratives that plenty of people have a quiet interest in keeping exactly as they are. And knowledge like that has a long, documented history of being pushed quietly out of view whenever it starts spreading too widely among ordinary people. Don't wait for a clearer sign to arrive before taking this seriously tonight, because it won't arrive dressed any differently than the quiet feeling you've already had right here. You didn't reach this exact sentence by accident, and some part of you has probably already sensed that, even if you haven't said it to yourself directly yet in so many words. Read with an open mind, without rushing toward the final page just to say you finished it completely tonight. Let certain lines sit longer than you expect them to at first, And if something in there reaches a part of you that's been sensing this quietly for a long time now, leave one word in the comments below. Desperto. Not as performance, not for anyone else watching, just as a quiet signal that some part of you is ready for this long before tonight ever gave it a name.